Rachel blocked the gate with her car. The black SUV sat sideways across the driveway, engine still running, headlights cutting across the quiet morning street. Emily Carter stepped out of her front door and froze. Rachel stood beside the hood with a folded document in one hand. Her other hand lifted slowly and pointed toward the house. Neighbors were already watching. Across the street, a man paused mid-step with his dog. A garage door stopped halfway open. Rachel's voice carried clearly through the cold morning air. Emily built this house on land that never belonged to her. Emily felt something inside her chest drop hard. Rachel lifted the paper higher so everyone could see it. County records say the transfer was never valid. Emily stood on the small concrete path, barefoot inside worn house slippers, laptop bag still hanging from her shoulder. The coffee in her hand had already gone cold. She'd woken up 10 minutes earlier expecting a normal morning. Instead, her sister had turned the street into a courtroom. Rachel took a slow step closer to the gate. "Morning, Emily." Emily forced herself to breathe. "Move your car." Rachel did not move. Instead, she glanced at the house behind Emily. 6 years. Emily blinked. "What?" Rachel tilted her head. "You really thought nobody would question it?" Emily felt heat rising into her face. "Question what?" Rachel lifted the paper again. "This property." Emily stared at the document. The top line showed the county seal. Her stomach tightened. Rachel spoke loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "The title transfer after Grandpa died. Apparently, it was never completed properly." Emily shook her head slowly. "That is not true." Rachel shrugged. "That is what the review request says." Emily stepped toward the gate, moved the car. Rachel smiled faintly. "Can't." Emily felt a strange ringing in her ears. "Why?" Rachel tapped the paper with one finger. "Because if the transfer was flawed, the house goes back to Dad." Silence fell across the street. The dog walker stopped moving entirely now. Emily stared at her sister. Rachel had always loved attention. Even as a kid, she used to create drama during family dinners. But this was different. This was deliberate. Emily tightened her grip on the iron bars of the gate. "You are not serious." Rachel leaned back against the SUV. "Mom and Dad will be here soon." Emily felt something colder than anger creep into her chest. "You called them." Rachel shrugged. They filed the request. Emily looked toward the quiet house behind her. The small backyard office she built 2 years ago sat near the fence. The garage renovation. The late nights, working under yellow desk light. The mortgage payments she made every month, her name was on everything. Rachel watched her face carefully. "You might want to start packing." Emily looked back at her. Rachel's smile returned. "Because if the review confirms the mistake, everything behind that gate stops being yours." Emily heard another engine turning onto the street. Rachel followed the sound and smiled wider. Perfect timing. Emily turned slowly. A silver sedan was approaching. Their parents' car, and Rachel spoke softly, almost cheerfully. "Let's see what the lawyer says today." The silver sedan rolled slowly toward the curb and stopped behind Rachel's SUV. For a moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Emily stood just inside the iron gate, fingers wrapped around the cold metal bars. The paper Rachel had been waving a minute ago was still in her sister's hand, fluttering slightly in the breeze like proof already decided. The driver's door opened. Their father stepped out first. His movements were slower than Emily remembered. One hand rested briefly on the roof of the car as if he needed the support. Then the passenger door opened. Their mother stepped onto the pavement, adjusting her coat even though the morning was not cold enough to need it. Rachel walked toward them immediately. Mom, Dad, Emily did not move. The neighbors had stopped pretending not to watch. The man with the dog lingered across the street. Another neighbor stood half hidden behind a mailbox. Her father glanced at the blocked driveway, then at Rachel. "You could have handled this more quietly." Rachel shrugged. "It needed to happen today." Emily finally spoke. "You filed a title dispute." Her father did not answer right away. Her mother did. "We requested a review." Emily stepped forward one pace. "Why?" Rachel spoke before either parent could respond. "Because the paperwork from Grandpa's estate might not have been completed correctly." Emily felt the words hit her like something physical. The transfer was done in the lawyer's office. Her father nodded slowly. Yes, Emily waited. But that single word felt like a crack forming under her feet. Her mother folded her hands. The county never finalized one of the documents. Emily stared at them. "You signed everything." Her father looked uncomfortable now. "We signed what the attorney prepared." Rachel lifted the paper again and held it toward Emily through the gate. "The county record shows the property still technically attached to Dad's estate file." Emily did not take the paper. She did not want to feel it in her hands. For 6 years she had lived inside that house believing the foundation of it was solid. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every late night in the small backyard office building the consulting business that paid for it all. Rachel watched her carefully. The land value alone is close to $2 million now. Emily turned her head slowly. "So that is what this is about." Rachel's voice remained calm. "It is about correcting a mistake." Emily looked back at her parents. "Is that how you see it?" Her mother spoke gently. "Emily, things have changed since Grandpa passed. Your sister never received anything from that property." Emily felt something bitter rise in her throat. Rachel had chosen to move to the city. Rachel had never wanted the house, until now. Rachel leaned casually against the SUV again. If the review confirms the transfer was flawed, the property returns to Dad. Emily waited. Rachel finished the thought. Then the family decides what to do with it. Emily looked past them toward the quiet house behind her. Sunlight was now touching the roofline. The small office window reflected the morning sky. For the first time, a strange calm settled over her. "You blocked my gate." Rachel nodded. "Yes." Emily's voice dropped lower. "You brought Mom and Dad." "Yes." Rachel crossed her arms. "And the county will look at the title today." Emily held her gaze. "Good." Rachel frowned slightly. "Good." Emily stepped back from the gate. "Because the lawyer who handled the original transfer should be here any minute." Rachel's expression shifted just enough to notice. And down the street, a dark blue sedan turned slowly onto Willow Creek Drive. The dark blue sedan rolled slowly onto Willow Creek Drive. Rachel saw it first. Her posture changed almost immediately. "Who is that?" Emily did not answer right away. She simply watched the car approach. The quiet sound of its tires moving across the asphalt louder than anything else in the still morning. The sedan stopped along the curb about 20 feet from the gate. The driver stepped out. Mid-50s, gray suit, calm movements, a leather briefcase in one hand. Emily felt her breathing steady slightly. Rachel squinted toward him. "You called a lawyer." Emily spoke quietly. "Yes." Rachel crossed her arms. "Already?" Emily looked at her. "You started this at 6:43 in the morning." Rachel did not respond. The man walked toward the driveway with the relaxed pace of someone used to tense situations. Their father straightened slightly when he recognized him. "Mr. Halvorson." The lawyer nodded politely. "Good morning." His eyes moved briefly from one face to another, absorbing the scene in seconds. The blocked driveway, the neighbors watching, the document still in Rachel's hand. He stopped near the gate beside Emily. I had a feeling this might turn into a family meeting. Rachel spoke first. "We requested a title review." Her tone carried a hint of confidence again. Halverson nodded once. "Yes, I received notice." Emily watched Rachel carefully. Rachel lifted the paper again. "County records show the property transfer after Grandpa died may not have been finalized correctly." Halverson extended his hand calmly. "May I see that?" Rachel hesitated for half a second before handing over the document. The lawyer read it slowly. The street was completely quiet now. Even the dog walker had stopped moving. Halverson closed the folder and returned it. "This is a preliminary review request." Rachel lifted her chin. "Exactly. If the transfer paperwork was incomplete, the property legally reverts." Halverson looked at her calmly. "Reverts to your father's estate record temporarily." Rachel nodded. "Then the family can redistribute the property properly." Emily remained silent. Halverson turned slightly toward her father. "When was the last time you reviewed the original closing file?" Her father shifted uncomfortably. 6 years ago." Halverson nodded slowly. "That is what I thought." Rachel spoke again. "The county database shows an incomplete filing." Halverson adjusted the briefcase in his hand. "County databases show many things before documents are fully processed." Rachel frowned. "Meaning?" Halverson looked toward Emily. "Meaning incomplete digital records do not override notarized transfers." Rachel's expression tightened slightly. "But if the filing was never submitted?" Halverson interrupted gently. "It was submitted." Emily watched Rachel's face. Rachel shook her head. "The county record shows otherwise." Halverson opened the briefcase. Inside were several folders. He removed one thick document file. The paper edges were worn from age. He opened it carefully and turned it toward Emily's father. Original transfer file. Notarized. Recorded. Time-stamped. Rachel leaned forward slightly. "That does not appear in the county portal." Halverson spoke calmly. "Because the portal only displays summary entries." Rachel's confidence slipped another fraction. Halverson turned another page. "The deed transfer was recorded at 10:12 a.m. on April 15th, 6 years ago." Emily remembered that day. The leather chairs in the attorney office, her father signing slowly, Rachel sitting silently in the corner. Halverson tapped the page lightly. "Your daughter became the legal owner that morning." Rachel stared at the paper. "But the review request." Halverson closed the folder. "A review request does not invalidate ownership." Rachel's arms slowly lowered. Across the street, someone whispered something to another neighbor. Emily felt the weight in her chest shift slightly. Rachel looked at their father. "Dad." Her father said nothing. Halverson spoke again. However, the single word pulled everyone's attention back. Rachel's eyes lifted quickly. "However." Halverson looked toward Emily. "The request filed this morning did raise another question." Emily felt her stomach tighten again. "What question?" Halverson met her eyes. "The complaint about unauthorized structures on the property." Rachel's voice came back quickly. "The backyard office, the garage rental." Halverson closed the folder calmly. Those issues could trigger a county inspection. Emily exhaled slowly. Rachel leaned forward slightly again. "So, the property may still face violations." Halverson looked toward the house behind the gate. "Possibly." Rachel's smile returned faintly. Emily felt the morning tension shift again. Not victory. Not defeat, just another turn. Halverson stepped back slightly from the gate. "Emily." Yes, the county inspector may arrive later today. Emily nodded slowly. Rachel crossed her arms again. Then we will see what happens. Halverson looked at Rachel quietly. Yes, we will, and for the first time that morning. Rachel was no longer completely certain she was winning. For a moment, nobody spoke. The quiet street had turned into a silent audience. Emily stood behind the iron gate, feeling the slow rhythm of her own breathing returning. The panic from earlier had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something steadier. Rachel was the first to break the silence. So, the house is still hers. The words sounded tight. Halverson closed the folder in his briefcase. Yes. Rachel looked at their father again. Dad. Her father rubbed one hand across his forehead. I thought the filing had a problem, Halverson answered calmly. Many people misunderstand how county portals display property records. Rachel's voice sharpened slightly, but the review request was valid. Halverson nodded. Yes, anyone can request a review. It does not change ownership. Rachel said nothing. Emily watched her carefully. For the first time that morning, Rachel's confidence looked less certain. Her sister had expected the conversation to end with the house already slipping away. Instead, the ground had shifted under her. Rachel lifted her chin again. Fine. She pointed toward the backyard. The illegal structures are still a problem. Emily felt the words land again. The small office building, the converted garage. Rachel spoke louder now, aware the neighbors were listening. Running a business from a residential property, renting out part of the garage. Those are zoning violations. Halverson looked at Emily. Did you apply for the permits? Emily hesitated. The permits had been filed 2 years earlier. A contractor had handled the paperwork. But suddenly the memory felt less certain. I believed the contractor submitted everything. Rachel smiled faintly, believed. Emily ignored her. Halverson spoke calmly. Do you have copies? Emily shook her head slowly. They should be on file with the county. Rachel gave a small laugh. Apparently not. Emily felt the same hollow pressure in her stomach return. Rachel stepped closer to the gate. You built your whole business here. Emily looked at her. Yes. Rachel tilted her head slightly. If the inspection finds violations. Emily waited. Rachel finished the sentence. The county can shut it down. The words hung in the air. Across the street, the neighbor with the dog shifted his weight. Emily felt anger flicker under the calm she had been forcing. Rachel had not just come to challenge ownership. She had come to collapse the entire life Emily had built on that land. Halverson spoke again. An inspection does not automatically mean closure. Rachel looked at him. But it can. Halverson nodded. If violations are severe. Emily's mind moved quickly now. Clients scheduled this week. The consulting contracts. The employees who used the office space in the converted garage. Rachel crossed her arms again. Maybe you should have checked the paperwork more carefully. Emily met her eyes. Maybe you should have talked to me before turning the street into a show. Rachel did not answer. Instead, she glanced down the block. Right on cue. A white county vehicle was turning slowly onto Willow Creek Drive. The logo on the door was clearly visible. Zoning and Inspection Services. Rachel smiled again. Perfect timing. The truck rolled closer and stopped beside the curb. The driver opened the door. A man in a navy jacket stepped out holding a tablet. Emily felt the tension return to her chest. Rachel leaned against the SUV. Looks like we are about to find out. Emily gripped the gate again as the inspector walked toward them. And suddenly the house behind her felt less like a home and more like evidence. The county inspector walked toward the driveway with steady, unhurried steps. He looked like a man who had seen hundreds of disputes exactly like this one. Mid-40s, short beard, navy county jacket zipped halfway, a tablet in one hand. He stopped near the curb and looked briefly at the blocked driveway, the gathered family, and the neighbors pretending not to stare. "Morning?" His voice was calm. Rachel stepped forward immediately. "Good morning." She gestured toward the house behind the gate. "We filed a complaint about zoning violations." The inspector nodded once. "Name?" "Rachel Carter." He tapped something on the tablet, then his eyes moved to Emily. "You are the property owner." Emily forced herself to answer evenly. "Yes, Emily Carter." The inspector nodded again. "I received a complaint regarding unpermitted construction and commercial activity on this lot." Rachel crossed her arms, watching closely. Emily felt every neighbor on the street listening. The inspector looked toward the backyard. "There's a detached structure behind the main house." Emily nodded. "A home office. Built 2 years ago." The inspector asked another question without looking up. "Permit number?" Emily hesitated. "The contractor handled that." Rachel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. The inspector looked up now. "You do not have the permit number." Emily shook her head slowly. "Not with me." He tapped the tablet again. "The county database currently shows no detached structure permit for this address." Rachel spoke quickly. "Exactly." The inspector raised one hand slightly without looking at her. "I will verify that." He stepped closer to the gate. "May I enter the property?" Emily unlocked the gate slowly. The iron hinge creaked as it opened. The inspector walked inside, scanning the yard with practiced eyes. Rachel remained outside the fence but leaned forward slightly to watch. Emily followed the inspector along the path toward the backyard. The small office building stood near the fence. White siding, 2 windows, a narrow wooden deck. Emily had spent countless late nights inside that room, building her consulting business. The inspector stopped a few feet away and studied the structure. He circled it slowly, checking the roofline, the electrical box, and the small air conditioning unit mounted along the side. Rachel's voice drifted through the open gate. "Looks pretty permanent." The inspector ignored the comment. He tapped several things into the tablet, then turned to Emily. "When was this constructed?" 2 years ago. Contractor name." Emily said the name quietly. The inspector searched the tablet again. Rachel leaned closer to the gate. Maybe the contractor forgot to file the permit. Emily ignored her. The inspector finally looked back up. The contractor did file a preliminary application. Emily felt a small spark of relief, but Rachel smiled slightly at that word. The inspector continued. The application was never finalized. Emily's stomach tightened again. What does that mean? It means the project approval was never issued. Rachel spoke loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "So, the structure is illegal." The inspector glanced toward her briefly. "It means the structure was built before approval was granted." Rachel's smile widened. Emily forced herself to stay calm. "What happens now?" The inspector walked toward the garage. The side door was slightly open, revealing the renovated interior space. 2 desks, computer monitors, a small coffee machine. The inspector looked inside. "You run a business here." "Consulting services," Rachel said quietly from the gate. "Commercial activity." The inspector continued entering information into the tablet. "The zoning classification for this area is residential only." Emily felt the morning sunlight on the back of her neck. "What are the consequences?" The inspector spoke matter-of-factly. "Typically, a correction notice is issued first," Rachel interrupted again, "or a shutdown order." The inspector looked at her calmly. Only in severe cases. Rachel did not look satisfied. Emily watched him carefully. What determined severe? The inspector turned back toward the small office building. Structural safety, electrical compliance, impact on the neighborhood. Rachel crossed her arms again, and illegal construction. The inspector closed the tablet. Yes? Emily felt the quiet street pressing in again. Neighbors watching. Her parents standing silently beside Rachel. The office that had taken 2 years to build. The business that had taken 6. The inspector spoke again. I will need to perform a full inspection of the structure. Emily nodded slowly. Rachel leaned closer to the gate. Take your time. The inspector looked at her once, then back at Emily. Do you have the construction documents? Emily swallowed. They should be in the house. The inspector nodded. Please retrieve them. Emily turned toward the back door of the house, her mind racing through file cabinets, emails, contractor invoices. Rachel's voice followed her from the gate. You should start packing just in case. Emily did not turn around. But inside her chest, something had shifted again. Rachel believed this morning was the end of Emily's house. Emily was beginning to realize it might only be the beginning of something else. Emily stepped inside the house and closed the door behind her. For a few seconds, the noise from the street disappeared. The silence inside felt heavy. The living room looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The couch with the gray blanket folded across the arm. The mug of coffee she had abandoned on the kitchen counter. Sunlight sliding slowly across the hardwood floor. It looked like a normal morning. But outside the gate, the entire foundation of her life was being examined. Emily moved quickly toward the hallway office. The metal filing cabinet stood against the wall. Second drawer, contracts, invoices, permits. Her hands moved faster than her thoughts. She pulled the drawer open. Folders shifted and rustled. Contractor agreement, electrical inspection, material invoices. She flipped through the stack quickly. Where is it? Her heart was beating harder again. The building permit approval should have been here. The contractor had promised everything was filed properly. Emily pulled out another folder. Emails, printed documents, receipts, but not the final permit approval. The quiet fear returned. Rachel's voice echoed in her mind. Maybe the contractor forgot to file the permit. Emily forced herself to breathe. Think. The contractor had sent something by email the week construction started. A confirmation from the county portal. Emily grabbed her laptop from the desk and opened it. The screen lit up slowly. Her inbox loaded. She searched the contractor's name. Dozens of messages appeared. Invoices, construction updates, photos of the framing. She scrolled quickly, then stopped. A subject line from 2 years earlier. County application confirmation. Emily opened the message. The email contained a reference number, but the document attached was only the application submission, not the approval. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair. Outside the house, she could hear faint voices. Rachel, the inspector, her parents. The entire situation unfolding while she searched for proof. Emily opened another message. Then another. Still no approval. A quiet knock came from the front door. Emily closed the laptop and walked to the entry. Halverson stood on the porch. His calm expression had not changed. Did you find the permit? Emily shook her head. Only the application. He nodded slowly. That happens sometimes. Emily looked at him. What does that mean? It means contractors submit applications before the county finishes the review. Emily felt the tension rise again, but construction already started. Yes? Emily's voice dropped. So, the inspector is right. Halverson spoke carefully. Possibly. Emily stared at the floor for a moment. Rachel is going to use this. Halverson did not argue. Yes, Emily rubbed her hands together, if the permit was never finalized. Halverson answered quietly. The county can issue a correction notice. Emily looked back toward the backyard window. Through the glass, she could see the inspector standing beside the office building. Rachel leaned against the gate, watching him like someone waiting for a verdict. Emily spoke again. What happens if the inspection fails? Halverson took a slow breath. Worst case. Emily waited. The structure must be removed. Emily closed her eyes briefly. 2 years of work, savings, late nights, clients sitting across the desk inside the room. All of it suddenly fragile. Halverson's voice softened slightly. But that is not the only possibility. Emily opened her eyes again. What else, if the structure meets safety codes? Emily listened carefully. The county may allow retroactive permitting. Emily felt a small shift of hope. Meaning you correct the paperwork and pay the penalty. Rachel's voice suddenly carried from outside. Inspector, look at the electrical box. Emily felt her jaw tighten. Halverson looked toward the backyard window. Your sister seems very invested in the inspection. Emily let out a quiet breath. Yes. Halverson spoke calmly. Then we should go back outside. Emily nodded, because this morning had already turned into a fight, and the real outcome had not been decided yet. Emily stepped back outside with Halverson walking beside her. The air felt colder than it had earlier that morning. Rachel was standing near the open gate now, arms crossed, watching the inspector carefully as if she were supervising the entire process. The inspector stood beside the small office building, crouched slightly near the electrical panel mounted on the outside wall. He tapped notes into the tablet. Rachel noticed Emily returning. Find the permit, Emily answered calmly. I found the application. Rachel smiled faintly, not the approval. Emily did not respond. Halverson walked forward and stopped beside the inspector. Morning again. The inspector nodded without looking up. Mr. Halverson, you know him. Halverson smiled slightly. Small county. The inspector stood and brushed dust from his jacket. Rachel stepped closer. Is the structure permitted? The inspector looked at her evenly. The permit application was submitted. Rachel waited. But the approval was never finalized. Rachel's smile widened. So, the structure is illegal. The inspector did not react to the tone. The structure was built before final approval. Rachel glanced toward the neighbors across the street, clearly aware they were still watching. Emily felt the moment turning again. Rachel wanted a public defeat. She wanted Emily standing there while the county declared the house out of compliance. The inspector walked toward the office door. May I enter? Emily nodded. Yes. The door opened with a soft creak. The small room inside looked exactly the way Emily had left it the night before. 2 desks, a wall of shelves filled with files. A large monitor connected to her laptop dock. The faint smell of coffee and printer ink. The inspector stepped inside and examined the ceiling beams. Electrical wiring. Fire detector. Rachel leaned through the doorway slightly. Running a business here. The inspector ignored her again. He checked the breaker panel, then the wiring around the air conditioning unit. Halverson stood quietly behind Emily. Rachel watched every movement like someone waiting for a mistake. The inspector walked back outside and circled the structure again. Then he crouched near the foundation. Concrete blocks, support beams. Rachel's voice came again. If the permit was never approved, it violates zoning code. The inspector stood slowly. Not necessarily. Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" The inspector pointed toward the office. "The structure itself is solid." Emily felt a small shift of relief. Rachel spoke quickly. "But the permit?" The inspector tapped the tablet again. "The issue here is administrative." Rachel crossed her arms. "Administrative? Construction started before final approval." Emily waited. The inspector continued. "But the application file includes the engineering review." Rachel said nothing. The inspector turned the tablet slightly toward Emily. "Structural safety passed during the preliminary review 2 years ago." Emily felt her chest loosen slightly. Rachel shook her head. "Then why was the permit never finalized?" The inspector shrugged. "Backlog." Emily blinked. "Backlog?" The inspector nodded. During that year, the county zoning office was months behind processing final approvals. Rachel looked irritated now. "So the structure stays." The inspector raised a hand slightly. "Not exactly." Rachel leaned forward again. "Then what?" The inspector spoke clearly. "A retroactive permit correction must be filed." Emily listened carefully. "The structure will remain if the correction is approved." Rachel stared at him. "And if it is not?" The inspector answered calmly. "Then the structure must be removed." Silence returned to the street. Rachel's confidence had weakened but had not disappeared. She glanced toward the garage. "What about the rental?" The inspector looked at the garage door. Emily felt the tension return again. Rachel spoke quietly. "Commercial activity in a residential zone." The inspector walked toward the garage slowly. Emily followed. Rachel followed too. The garage door opened halfway when Emily pressed the remote. Inside the converted space, 2 desks sat beside a large printer and file cabinet. Rachel looked satisfied. "See?" The inspector stepped inside. He examined the desks, the monitors, the client chairs. Then he looked back at Emily. "How many people work here?" "3, including me." Rachel folded her arms again. "Commercial operation." The inspector entered something else into the tablet. Emily waited. Rachel waited. Then the inspector spoke again. "This part may be a bigger problem." Rachel's smile returned immediately. Emily felt the ground shift once more beneath her feet. The inspector stood in the middle of the converted garage, studying the room in silence. The space had once held Emily's car. Now it looked more like a small office suite. 2 desks sat against the wall. A printer hummed quietly in sleep mode. File cabinets lined the corner beside a narrow window. Emily could suddenly see the room through the inspector's eyes. Not a garage, a workplace. Rachel leaned against the garage doorway, arms folded. 3 employees. Emily answered quietly. "Including me." Rachel looked satisfied. "That is a business." The inspector tapped several notes into the tablet. "This zoning district allows limited home office activity." Emily listened carefully. "Limited." The inspector continued. 1 resident working from home. No additional staff on site. Rachel nodded slowly. "Exactly." Emily felt her stomach tighten again. The inspector looked at the desks. "Do your employees work here every day?" "Yes." Rachel spoke quickly. "Commercial use?" The inspector ignored the tone and continued. "Do clients visit the property? Sometimes." Rachel's smile widened slightly. Emily kept her voice steady. "Usually virtual meetings." The inspector walked slowly around the room. He examined the electrical outlets, the extension cables under the desks, the additional router mounted on the wall. Rachel spoke again. She renovated this space 2 years ago. Emily did not turn toward her. The inspector looked up. Was the garage conversion part of the same permit application as the backyard office? Emily shook her head. No. Rachel spoke immediately. Because there was no permit. Emily felt heat rise in her face, but forced herself to stay calm. The contractor said interior work did not require one. The inspector nodded slightly. Minor interior changes sometimes do not. Rachel tilted her head. Sometimes. The inspector crouched beside the electrical panel inside the garage. Additional circuits, new outlets, commercial equipment. He stood again. These upgrades typically require electrical permits. Rachel's expression brightened again. So, it is illegal. The inspector raised a hand. It means the upgrades were not registered. Emily felt the word registered land heavily. Rachel stepped forward. Which means it violates zoning. The inspector closed the tablet for a moment and looked at Emily directly. If employees regularly work here, the property is operating as a small commercial office. Emily swallowed slowly. Yes. Rachel spoke quietly but clearly. Residential zoning violation. The inspector opened the tablet again. The county may require the commercial activity to stop. Emily felt the words hit like a weight pressing down on her chest. Rachel said nothing now. She did not need to. The silence itself felt like confirmation. Emily forced herself to ask the question. What happens next? The inspector answered calmly. A formal notice will likely be issued. Rachel leaned against the doorway again. Meaning, the inspector continued, you will be given time to correct the violation. Emily listened carefully. Correct how? The inspector held her gaze. Either remove the commercial activity or apply for a zoning variance. Rachel let out a small laugh. Those almost never get approved. The inspector did not confirm or deny that. He simply entered another note into the tablet. Emily looked around the garage. The desks where her employees worked every morning. The printer that ran constantly during tax season. The shelves filled with client files. 6 years of work had slowly grown into this space. Rachel spoke again. So, the business has to shut down. Emily did not answer. The inspector closed the tablet. Not necessarily. Rachel frowned. What do you mean? The inspector looked back toward the house. That depends on something else. Emily waited. The inspector spoke calmly. Who filed the original complaint? Rachel's smile returned. I did. The inspector nodded slowly. Then he looked back at Emily, and suddenly his tone shifted slightly, because that changes how the case moves forward. Rachel's smile stayed in place for a moment. Then she noticed the inspector's tone had changed. What do you mean? The inspector stood near the garage entrance, tablet resting against his forearm. The street had grown even quieter. A second neighbor had stepped out onto the sidewalk. Emily could feel the weight of their attention pressing into the moment. The inspector looked calmly at Rachel. You said you filed the complaint. Rachel nodded. Yes. The inspector tapped the screen once. Under your name. Rachel lifted her chin slightly. Correct. Emily watched the exchange carefully. The inspector continued. The county takes complaints seriously. Rachel looked satisfied again. Good. The inspector's expression remained neutral. But complaints filed by family members about the same property sometimes fall into a different review category. Rachel frowned slightly. What category? The inspector answered simply. Domestic property disputes. Rachel's arms slowly lowered. That is not what this is. The inspector did not argue. He simply spoke evenly. When a complaint comes from a family member who does not live at the property, the county verifies whether the issue is primarily legal rather than public safety. Rachel crossed her arms again. The structures are illegal. The inspector nodded. They may require correction. Emily noticed the careful wording. Rachel leaned forward slightly. Then why does it matter who reported it? The inspector looked toward Emily briefly. Because enforcement priority changes depending on risk to the public. Rachel's confidence slipped another fraction. Meaning, the inspector gestured lightly toward the backyard office. The structure appears stable. Electrical systems appear functional. There's no visible hazard to the neighborhood. Rachel said nothing. The inspector continued. So, this case will likely be classified as administrative compliance. Rachel blinked. Administrative? Emily felt a quiet breath leave her lungs. Rachel shook her head. But the zoning violation. The inspector nodded again. Yes, Emily must correct the zoning issue. Rachel's voice sharpened. Which means the business shuts down. The inspector held her gaze calmly. Not immediately. Rachel's jaw tightened. What do you mean? The inspector entered another note into the tablet. Standard correction window is 60 days. Emily felt the number land inside her chest. 60 days. Rachel looked stunned. 60 days. The inspector nodded. Time to file the retroactive permit correction. Time to apply for zoning adjustment or relocate employees. Rachel stared at him. That is 2 months. The inspector simply nodded again. Rachel turned toward Emily. 2 months will not save your business. Emily did not answer, because in that moment something else had become clear. Rachel had expected the county to shut everything down immediately. Instead, the inspector had turned the situation into a deadline. Rachel spoke again. You still lose. Emily looked at her calmly. Maybe. Rachel stepped closer to the garage entrance. You built everything on shaky ground. Emily met her gaze, and you turned it into a spectacle. Rachel opened her mouth to answer, but the inspector spoke again. There is one more matter. Everyone turned toward him. The inspector scrolled through the tablet. The complaint submitted this morning included an additional request. Rachel looked slightly confused. What request? The inspector read directly from the screen. A title ownership review. Rachel nodded quickly. Yes. The inspector glanced toward Halverson. The attorney who handled the transfer. Halverson stepped forward slightly. Yes. The inspector continued reading. The complaint states that the property transfer 6 years ago may have been executed improperly. Rachel folded her arms again. Exactly. The inspector looked back at Emily. That issue is outside county zoning authority. Rachel frowned. Then who decides it? Halverson answered quietly. A civil court. Rachel turned toward him. Then we will take it there. Emily watched her sister carefully. Rachel's voice grew colder. Because if the court finds the transfer invalid... Rachel pointed toward the house behind the gate. Everything on this land stops belonging to you. Silence settled again across the street. Emily looked past Rachel. The morning sun now lit the roof of the house. 6 years of her life lived inside those walls. Rachel waited for her reaction. Instead, Emily spoke calmly. If... Rachel blinked. What? Emily held her gaze. If the court finds the transfer invalid. Rachel said nothing. Because for the first time that morning, the fight was no longer happening on the street. It was moving somewhere much bigger. The inspector finished entering the final notes into the tablet. The screen went dark when he locked it. For a moment, the entire street felt suspended between two outcomes. Rachel was the first to speak again. So, the county will not shut the place down today. Her tone carried frustration she could no longer hide. The inspector shook his head. No. Rachel pressed her lips together. Emily watched the reaction carefully. The confident smile Rachel had worn earlier that morning had slowly disappeared piece by piece. The inspector stepped toward the gate. You will receive the official notice within the next few days. Emily nodded, and I have 60 days. Yes. Rachel crossed her arms again. 60 days will not fix illegal construction and a zoning violation. Emily did not answer. The inspector looked toward the backyard office one last time. The structure itself appears safe. Rachel exhaled sharply. Safe does not make it legal. The inspector did not respond. Instead, he stepped outside the gate and walked toward his truck. Rachel watched him leave, clearly dissatisfied. The engine started a few seconds later. The white county vehicle slowly disappeared down the street. The audience across the road began to disperse. The dog walker finally continued down the sidewalk. A garage door closed. The quiet neighborhood returned piece by piece, but the tension between the four people standing near the gate remained. Rachel turned toward Emily. 2 months. Emily said nothing. Rachel stepped closer. You cannot undo 6 years of mistakes in 60 days. Emily finally spoke. Maybe I do not have to. Rachel tilted her head slightly. You built a business where it is not allowed. Emily held her gaze. And you filed a complaint hoping it would collapse today. Rachel did not deny it. Their father cleared his throat quietly. Rachel ignored him. Emily continued calmly. You expected the county to shut everything down this morning. Rachel's voice dropped lower. It should have. Emily glanced toward the house behind her. Sunlight now filled the front yard. For a moment, she imagined what the place would look like if the office building disappeared. If the garage returned to holding nothing but a car, 6 years erased. Rachel spoke again. You are still losing. Emily looked back at her. Maybe. Rachel stepped closer to the gate. But when this goes to court... Emily raised one hand slightly. If it goes to court... Rachel frowned. It will. Halverson spoke for the first time in several minutes. Not necessarily. Rachel turned toward him sharply. Why not? Halverson adjusted the briefcase in his hand. Because a civil case requires evidence of an invalid transfer. Rachel lifted the document she'd been holding since morning. We already requested the review. Halverson shook his head slightly. A review request is not evidence. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Emily watched the exchange quietly. Halverson continued, the notarized transfer file remains valid. Rachel looked at her father again. Dad signed the documents. Their father shifted his weight again. Yes, Rachel spoke slowly. Then we will prove the filing mistake. Emily finally stepped forward again. Rachel. Rachel looked back at her. What? Emily's voice was calm but firm. You blocked my gate at sunrise. Rachel said nothing. Emily continued. You brought Mom and Dad. You filed complaints. You called the county. Rachel's jaw tightened. Yes. Emily met her eyes. And you expected everything I built here to collapse in one morning. Rachel did not answer. Emily took a slow breath. But the morning is not over yet. Rachel frowned slightly. What does that mean? Emily looked toward the street where the inspector's truck had disappeared. Then back at Rachel. It means something else is about to happen. Rachel stared at her. What? Emily's voice stayed quiet. Because the contractor who built that office called me back 20 minutes ago. Rachel blinked. Emily held her gaze. And he said something very interesting about the permits. Rachel's expression tightened immediately. What did he say? Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she looked down the quiet street for a moment, letting the silence stretch longer than Rachel liked. Her sister shifted her weight. Well, Emily finally spoke. He said the permit approval was issued. Rachel frowned. That is impossible. Emily kept her voice calm. That is what he told me. Rachel shook her head. The county database shows no approval. Halverson spoke quietly beside Emily. The public portal does not always show the full record. Rachel turned toward him. You already said that. Halverson nodded. Yes. Rachel looked back at Emily. Then where is the permit? Emily met her eyes. That is the interesting part. Rachel waited. Emily continued. The contractor said the final approval was delivered by mail. Rachel blinked. Mail? Emily nodded. 2 years ago. Rachel laughed once, sharp and short. So you lost it. Emily did not react. The contractor also said something else. Rachel's voice grew impatient. What? Emily's gaze moved toward their father for a brief second. The permit approval was signed by the county inspector who handled the project review. Rachel crossed her arms. And? Emily spoke slowly. He also said the county requested one additional signature before the final record was uploaded to the public portal. Rachel's eyebrows tightened. Whose signature? Emily answered quietly. The property owner. Rachel's expression changed slightly. That makes sense. Emily waited a moment, then added one more sentence. But the owner's signature line on the permit was already filled in. Rachel looked confused. Of course it was. Emily held her gaze. It was not my signature. The words landed heavily in the quiet street. Rachel blinked once, then again. What? Emily repeated calmly. The permit file shows a signature that is not mine. Rachel's face lost color for the first time that morning. That does not prove anything. Halverson stepped slightly forward. Actually, it proves something very specific. Rachel turned toward him. What? Halverson spoke in the same calm tone he had used all morning. If the permit approval required the owner's signature and someone else signed it. Rachel said nothing. Halverson continued. That person may have represented themselves as the property owner. Rachel's jaw tightened. The contractor must have made a mistake. Emily shook her head. The contractor said the signature was provided during the final inspection visit. Rachel looked at her father quickly. Dad. Her father did not answer. Emily continued speaking slowly. The contractor remembered because the inspector asked for confirmation that the owner approved the electrical upgrades. Rachel's breathing had changed now, shorter, sharper. Emily looked at her carefully. The contractor also remembers who signed the paper, Rachel whispered. Who? Emily answered without raising her voice. You. Rachel stepped backward slightly. That is not true. Emily's eyes stayed steady. You were here that day. Rachel shook her head quickly. I do not remember that. Emily spoke quietly. You visited during construction. Rachel's voice rose. That does not mean I signed anything. Halverson opened the folder he had been carrying. Then perhaps this will help. Rachel stared as he pulled out a printed document. A scanned permit approval page. The signature line clearly visible. Halverson turned the page toward Rachel. The handwriting was easy to recognize. Rachel Carter. Rachel's breathing stopped for a moment. Emily watched her sister carefully. Halverson spoke again. The county file includes the permit approval. Rachel whispered no. Halverson finished the sentence calmly. Signed by Rachel Carter. Rachel looked at the page like it had betrayed her. Emily spoke quietly. You signed as the property owner. Rachel's eyes lifted slowly. That was 2 years ago. Emily nodded. Yes. Rachel's voice trembled slightly. So. Emily held her gaze. So you just proved something very important. Rachel waited. Emily finished the thought calmly. 2 years ago you publicly claimed the property was mine. Silence filled the street. Rachel stood frozen beside the gate. Because the paper in Halverson's hand had quietly destroyed the argument she had been building all morning. Rachel stared at the paper in Halverson's hand. For several seconds she did not speak. The quiet street that had watched the entire morning unfold now felt almost too still. Emily could hear the faint rustle of leaves from the tree near the curb. Rachel's voice finally came out thin. That does not mean anything. Halverson remained calm. "It means quite a lot." Rachel shook her head quickly. "I signed something the contractor handed me, that is all." Emily watched her sister carefully. Rachel had always been confident when she believed she was winning. Now the certainty was gone. Halverson spoke evenly. "You signed as the property owner." Rachel crossed her arms again, but the movement looked defensive now. "That does not make me the owner." Emily answered quietly. "No. It means you acknowledge that I was." Rachel looked at her sharply. "That is your interpretation." Halverson lifted the document slightly. The county inspector required the owner's signature to approve the final permit. Rachel said nothing. Halverson continued. "If you signed as the owner, you represented to the county that Emily Carter held the title." Rachel's eyes flicked toward their father. "Dad." Her father looked down at the pavement. Rachel's voice grew tighter. "That does not change the original transfer." Halverson nodded slowly. "The transfer was already valid." Rachel looked at him with frustration. "Then why does this matter?" Halverson answered calmly. "Because courts examine behavior after a transfer." Rachel frowned. "Behavior?" Emily spoke quietly. "What people do when they believe ownership is settled." Rachel said nothing. Emily continued. 2 years ago, you helped finalize a permit on this property." Rachel's breathing quickened slightly. Emily held her gaze. "You signed the document. You stood in this yard and told the inspector I owned the house." Rachel shook her head again. "I do not remember saying that." Halverson spoke again. "The permit file includes the inspection notes." Rachel looked at him. "What notes?" Halverson opened the folder and turned another page. The inspector recorded that the owner's sister was present during the final visit. Rachel's face tightened. Emily felt the weight of the moment settling into place. The entire argument Rachel had built that morning depended on one idea, that Emily's ownership had always been uncertain. But 2 years earlier, Rachel herself had helped to confirm it. Rachel turned toward their father again. "You said the filing might be incomplete." Her father spoke quietly now. "That is what we believed." Rachel pointed at the paper. "This does not prove anything about the title." Halverson closed the folder slowly. "Perhaps not by itself." Rachel waited. Halverson continued. "But it shows that for years no one questioned the ownership." Emily watched Rachel carefully. Rachel had started the morning standing in the street like a prosecutor. Now she looked like someone discovering that her own evidence had turned against her. Rachel spoke again, quieter now. "So what happens next?" Emily answered calmly. "You wanted a court." Rachel said nothing. Emily finished the thought. "Now the court will see everything." Rachel stared at the house behind the gate. Sunlight filled the yard completely now. The office building, the garage workspace, the place where Emily had spent 6 years building a life. Rachel finally spoke again. "You still have zoning problems." Emily nodded. "Yes." Rachel's voice regained a small edge. "Your business may still shut down." Emily did not argue. "Maybe." Rachel looked back at her. "But the house." Emily met her gaze steadily. "The house is not going anywhere." Rachel stood silent beside the gate. Because after everything that had happened that morning, that was the one thing she could no longer change. Rachel did not leave. Even after the street had returned to normal and the neighbors slowly disappeared back into their houses, she remained standing near the gate. Her arms were no longer crossed. She looked smaller now. Emily stood inside the yard beside Halverson, watching her carefully. Their parents had stepped a few feet away, speaking quietly to each other near the silver sedan. For a long moment, no one said anything. Finally, Rachel spoke. "You think this proves everything?" Emily answered calmly, "It proves enough." Rachel shook her head. No. Her voice sounded tired now, not angry, not confident, just tired. Emily waited. Rachel looked at the house again. 6 years. Emily nodded slightly. Yes. Rachel let out a slow breath. "You built everything here." Emily did not respond. Rachel turned toward her again. "Did you ever wonder why nobody argued before?" Emily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Rachel stepped closer to the gate. "You really think Mom and Dad suddenly woke up this morning and decided to challenge the house?" Emily watched her face carefully. Something in Rachel's expression had changed. The performance from earlier that morning was gone. Now she looked almost uneasy. Emily spoke quietly. "Then why did you do it?" Rachel hesitated. Her eyes flicked briefly toward their parents, then back to Emily. "Because something happened last month." Emily waited. Rachel continued slowly. "Dad met with a developer." Emily felt a small shift in her chest. "What developer?" Rachel spoke quietly. "A company buying land across this neighborhood." Emily looked down the street instinctively. Several houses had sold during the last year. Rachel continued. "They are planning a small residential project." Emily said nothing. Rachel looked back at the house again. "The developer offered to buy this property." Emily felt the sentence land heavily. "Buy." Rachel nodded. 2.8 million. Halverson raised his eyebrows slightly. Emily stared at her sister. Rachel spoke again, "But the offer only works if the property is clean." Emily frowned. "Clean." Rachel's voice lowered. "No zoning issues, no construction violations, clear ownership." Emily slowly understood. Rachel had not just tried to take the house, she had tried to reset the ownership structure. Emily asked quietly, "So you wanted the property back under Dad's name?" Rachel nodded. "Then the family sells." Emily looked at her parents. They avoided her eyes. Rachel continued, "Divide the money evenly." Emily felt anger rising again. "You tried to destroy my business for that?" Rachel's voice sharpened. "You built a business on land that could be worth millions." Emily stepped closer to the gate. "I built a life here." Rachel shook her head. "You built something temporary." Emily stared at her. "Temporary." Rachel gestured toward the neighborhood. "Developers are buying everything around here." Emily said nothing. Rachel continued, "Within 3 years, this street will not look the same." Emily looked at the house behind her again. The office, the yard, the garage workspace. Rachel spoke quietly. "Dad thinks selling now is the smart move." Emily turned back toward her. "Then why did you block my gate like a criminal investigation?" Rachel's voice dropped again. "Because if you refused." Emily waited. Rachel finished the sentence. "The zoning violations could force you to sell anyway." The truth settled into the space between them. Rachel had not simply tried to win an argument. She had tried to corner Emily into a decision. Emily spoke slowly. "You wanted me scared enough to walk away." Rachel did not deny it. Halverson spoke quietly beside Emily. "And now?" Rachel looked down at the pavement. "Now the developer deal probably dies." Emily felt a strange calm spread through her chest, because for the first time that morning she understood the real battle. It had never been about permits or inspections, or even the house. It had been about something much larger, the land, and what someone believed it was worth. The street had gone quiet again. The last neighbor closed their front door. A car passed slowly at the end of the block and disappeared. Only the Carter family remained standing near the gate. Emily looked at Rachel, then at their parents. So that was the plan. Her father finally spoke. Emily. His voice sounded older than it had that morning. It was only a discussion. Rachel shook her head slightly. It was more than that. Their mother stepped forward. We were thinking about the future. Emily let out a quiet breath. My future, or yours? No one answered immediately. Rachel looked at the house again. You have to understand something. Emily waited. Rachel gestured toward the neighborhood. 3 houses on the street sold last year. Emily nodded slightly. I know, Rachel continued. The developer bought 2 of them. Emily's chest tightened. And the third. Rachel looked directly at her. They tried to buy this one first. Emily felt the words sink in. When? Rachel answered, about 8 months ago. Emily turned toward her parents. You never told me. Her father rubbed his forehead again. We did not want to pressure you. Emily almost laughed. Instead, you tried to take the house. Her mother spoke softly. We thought if the property came back under the estate. Emily finished the sentence quietly. You could sell it. Rachel did not deny it. The offer was large, $2.8 million. Emily looked back at the house behind her. 6 years of mortgage payments, repairs, renovations, long nights building her consulting firm in the office behind the fence. Rachel spoke again. Split 3 ways, that is almost $1 million each. Emily looked at her. You turned my life into a number. Rachel's voice sharpened slightly. It is not just your life. Emily stepped closer to the gate. I live here, Rachel answered, and the rest of us inherit here. Emily felt the argument tighten again. Halverson remained silent beside her, watching. Rachel continued. Dad thinks the developer will come back with an even bigger offer, Emily asked quietly. And you believe that? Rachel nodded. This entire neighborhood will change. Emily looked down the street. The houses did look different lately. Construction trucks, new fences, survey markers appearing along sidewalks. Rachel spoke again. Developers do not stop once they start buying land. Emily turned back toward her. That does not mean I have to sell. Rachel shook her head slowly. You might not have a choice eventually. Emily held her gaze. That is the future. Rachel's expression tightened. Exactly. Emily pointed toward the house. But this is the present. Rachel looked frustrated now. You are being emotional. Emily's voice remained calm. I am being practical. Rachel crossed her arms again. You are sitting on land worth millions. Emily nodded. And I built something here. Rachel looked toward the backyard office. A small consulting business. Emily did not react to the dismissive tone. Rachel continued. A developer will flatten this entire street. Emily spoke quietly. Maybe. Rachel stepped closer to the gate again. Then why fight this? Emily answered without hesitation. Because it is still my home. Rachel stared at her. Their father spoke again. Emily. Emily turned toward him. Yes. He looked at the house. You really would turn down that kind of money. Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she looked through the yard. The office window reflecting the afternoon light. The garage workspace. The path she walked every morning. Then she looked back at her family. Yes? Rachel shook her head in disbelief. You are walking away from millions. Emily spoke calmly. No. She paused. I am choosing something else. Rachel frowned. What? Emily met her eyes. The right to decide when my life changes. The words settled heavily in the air. Rachel looked down the street again, toward the houses the developer had already bought, then back at Emily, and for the first time that morning, Rachel seemed unsure whether the fight she had started was really about money at all. No one spoke for a long moment. The quiet suburban street that had watched the entire morning unfold now looked ordinary again. Cars passed in the distance. A child's bicycle rolled down the sidewalk 2 houses away. But the tension around the Carter family had not disappeared. Rachel stood beside the gate, staring at the house. Their father leaned against the silver sedan. Their mother looked tired. Emily stood inside the yard with the key still in her hand. The house behind her felt different now, not threatened, but tested. Rachel finally spoke again. "You really mean it?" Emily nodded. "Yes." Rachel looked at her carefully. "Even after everything today?" Emily answered quietly, especially after today. Rachel shook her head slowly. $2.8 million. Emily gave a small breath that was almost a laugh. "You keep saying that number." Rachel looked frustrated. "Because it matters." Emily stepped closer to the gate. "Money always matters." Rachel waited. "But it does not decide everything." Rachel pointed toward the house. "You are protecting a building." Emily shook her head. "No." She looked around the yard. The office she built, the garage workspace, the small path where she drank coffee every morning. "I am protecting the life inside it." Rachel said nothing. Emily continued calmly. "You tried to scare me this morning." Rachel looked away. Emily spoke again. "You blocked my gate. You called the county. You tried to turn neighbors into witnesses." Rachel finally met her eyes again. "Yes." Emily's voice stayed steady, and it still did not change the truth. Rachel waited. Emily finished the sentence. "This house is mine." The words were not loud, but they carried the kind of certainty that did not need volume. Their father slowly stood straighter. Rachel looked toward him. "Dad." He looked tired now. "Older. Maybe we pushed too hard." Rachel frowned. "You wanted the sale too?" Their father nodded slowly. "Yes, but not like this." Their mother finally stepped forward. "Emily." Emily looked at her. "We thought you would understand." Emily answered quietly. "You never asked." Her mother lowered her eyes. Rachel exhaled sharply. "So that is it." Emily tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Rachel gestured toward the street. "You keep the house. You keep the business." Emily nodded. "Yes." Rachel looked down the block toward the houses the developer had already purchased. "They will come back again." Emily did not argue. "Probably." Rachel asked one more question. "And if they offer $3 million next time?" Emily gave a small smile. "Then I will decide then." Rachel studied her face for several seconds. Then something changed in her expression. Not defeat, not acceptance, something closer to understanding. "You always were stubborn." Emily shrugged slightly. "Sometimes that is the only way to protect something important." Rachel finally stepped away from the gate. Their father opened the car door. Their mother followed. Rachel paused before getting into the SUV. She looked back at the house once more, then at Emily. "This morning did not go the way I expected." Emily answered quietly. "It rarely does." Rachel nodded once. Then she got into the car. The engine started. A few seconds later, the SUV pulled away from the curb. The silver sedan followed. Within moments, the street was empty again. Emily stood there for a while. The yard was quiet. The office window reflected the afternoon sun. Halverson closed his briefcase beside her. The soft click of the latch cut through the silence. "Well." Emily looked at him. "That was not how I planned to start the day." He smiled slightly. "Few things worth protecting ever are." Emily walked slowly back toward the house. The gate closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time since the morning began, the street was peaceful again. If this story made you think about family, property, and the difficult choices people make when money enters the picture, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have sold the house for millions or protected the life you built there? And if you enjoy realistic stories about family conflict, hidden motives, and quiet justice, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the biggest battles do not happen in court. They happen right in front of your own gate.